Well, good evening. It's time for us to begin our Bible class. And if you will be opening your books to Zechariah, this is where we are going to be. We're actually going to be here for the next 6, maybe 7 lessons. I can't remember exactly what the syllabus has laid out for us, but we're going to be spending a great deal of time in this book. And just part of the reason for that is because it's the longest of the 3 prophets that we are looking at. Consisting of 14 chapters, but another aspect of the book is that it's quite difficult in light of the fact in the way that it is written. And so it should be an interesting study. I hope it'll be one that'll be beneficial to us as we seek to try to figure out the message that Zechariah, first of all, was getting across to the people that he was writing to, but then second of all, what we can get from it as a result of the fact that it's been preserved for us so that we can learn the things that the people of Israel also needed to know. So we're going to begin with a word of prayer, and I've asked Roy if he would lead us in that prayer, and then we'll get into our study.
Father in heaven, we thank you for giving us today life, all the blessings of this privilege we have of coming together for study. Pray from this study, dear Father, to gain knowledge and to help to us, to make the word, how you want us to live, how you want us to die. Pray that we picture, give us all our sins. In your name I pray.
Amen. Thank you, Roy. You know, a number of years ago, there was a book that was recommended to me by a good friend of mine. The title of it is called The Lonely Crowd, and it was written by David Reisman and Nathan Glazer, who are a couple of sociologists. Reisman is now dead, but Glazer is still alive. And they're very far, at least Glazer, I would put him on the far left of the political spectrum. But this book was prescient in so many ways, written back in the 1950s, because what it's talking about are the things that are going on today. And the whole book was about was basically a sociological analysis of the middle-class American. And it divides it up into different groups. And consequently, what happens is it comes up with a lonely crowd. And I would recommend the book. It's somewhat dated as far as its content is concerned with respect to anecdotes and things of that nature. But as far as the principles that are in it, as I said, it was very prescient in the sense that the things he was looking at are things that are happening today. And I think one of the greatest manifestations of that is social media and how people have conformed to that and allow themselves to be influenced so much by social media. And that was back in the 1950s when he wrote this. But one of the things I got from the book that was very helpful for me as far as being a preacher and trying to be able to discern messages that are contained within other books that are biblical. And of course, these guys would never acknowledge that they were biblical, but indeed they are biblical. And that is the fact that when people go through difficult times, there's mindsets that develop. And there are particularly 2 mindsets that develop, which is part of, now they didn't articulate it this way, but they did speak about it in this sense. And that is that there are 2 primary ways that people oftentimes who are going through difficult times, how that they handle this. The lonely crowd is the one who stands up to it, who is willing to take a stand for what they believe is right and be an individual as opposed to following the crowd and things of that nature. And that's the point that they're trying to get, that that's the way everybody needs to be. And I would amen that. I think that's the way everybody needs to be. But in the process of that book, what I learned from it is that there are 2 ways when people especially are experiencing difficulties that they react. One of the ways is assimilation. And basically the point is that people finally try, they've been trying to be different, they've been trying to stand out in the sense that they stand for something that is of value to them, but it becomes very difficult for them, and so consequently what winds up happening is they assimilate themselves to the culture. And so what happens as a result of that is they begin to adopt their speech, they begin to adopt their customs, they begin to adopt even their religion, and they begin to adopt a lot of the political ways in which people think and the way they carry on. So assimilation is one. The other one is despair. And what I believe that was suggesting is the idea of a sense of hopelessness, that there's really nothing that we can do. And so consequently what happens is people just kind of withdraw. And as they withdraw, they become angry, they become depressed, they become anxious, because of the things that are going on in the world around them. Now again, remember, this was written in the 1950s, and it's talking about, I think, what is obviously, they were sociologists. Sociologists before, the departments of sociology were so affected by the stuff that is in the systems of higher education today. These men were true sociologists. And I believe that in looking at that, it helps me to introduce what we're going to be talking about with respect to the book of Zechariah. So I've asked a couple of questions right from the very beginning that are in the New Testament. And it helps us then to be able to understand oftentimes how children of God find themselves in a world that is difficult to live in, going through difficult times, experiencing hardships, particularly as a result of the faith that they have in Christ. And so I asked these two questions, the first one being passages out of 1 John chapter 2, verses 15 through 17, and 2 Corinthians chapter 6, beginning in verse 14 and going through chapter 7, verse 1, which is where I think the chapter should have actually ended. But I ask you, what do those two passages teach us about the calling of God's children? Now, I'm not going to read them because I'm assuming everybody has read those, and probably many of you are already familiar with them anyway because they are used so frequently. But what do you get from those two particular passages that I gave you with respect to the calling of the children of God? Okay, but to put God first, that's right. But there's something that is even more fundamental than that. I don't know how you can get more fundamental than putting God first, but there's an aspect of that I'm particularly looking for. What were you going to say, Joe? Okay, that's right. To be separate from the world. To come out from the world, to be different. Mark?
Really, the two passages point out that they don't have very much in common. Even though our existence is on the same plane for a while, if you have to be too sci-fi there. But really, they're almost at opposite ends. That from the two passages taken together, that they're pursuing opposite things. So the arbor would be distant and recognize that you can't be part of that. But part of the reason you can't be part of that is they want completely different things from God.
Right. And that goes to what Roy was saying about putting God first. And so children of God, just by the very nature of our calling, it's going to be different for us in the world in which we live. That's just part of the territory. And like John said, if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in it. And then he goes on to point out the reason why for all of that. Okay? And then the second question I ask is responding positively to the call of the gospel. What does John 15, verses 18 through 20, and 1 Peter 4, the first two verses in verse 12, teach us about what we should anticipate? Anybody have any thoughts about that one? Cynthia? Okay. Right. And that's the consequence of being different, right? I mean, people who are different, who purposely choose to be different, are going to be looked upon, first of all, suspiciously. But second of all, they may even make your life miserable. And that's what I believe Jesus is teaching in John 15 when he said that if they persecuted me, they are going to persecute you. And what Peter was talking about with respect to the Gentiles, talking about the unsaved, and how that they would respond to people who are saved, who are now living a different kind of life based upon the fact that their value system is now founded upon the gospel and upon God and the values that God would have us to have. Okay, so what winds up happening then, it seems to me, is that for many Christians, they begin this walk. They begin their journey of faith. And as they begin this journey of faith, they begin to recognize that being different is difficult. It's a challenge. Because if we are going to be different, we have to anticipate that people are going to think weirdly of us. They're going to think we're weird. Or that we might perhaps have our value system based upon some antiquated ethical system that is so ancient that what we need to do is come into the 21st century and start living the kind of life that would be indicative of somebody who was a part of the Enlightenment, or in this case, the post-Enlightenment, postmodernism. That this is the way we need to be living our lives. And so as a result of that, there can be challenges that come with this. And so for many people, what winds up happening then, those who have become children of God, is that they do one of these two things. Because of the challenges and the difficulties, they assimilate. They become like the rest of the world, adopting the ways of the world. And that consequently then lessens the trials. It makes the hardships much easier to endure, and it seems to make life easier because you're not really that much different from the people of the world. So there is that aspect, the assimilation part. But then on the other hand, people who don't want to assimilate and who are not comfortable being different from the world oftentimes find themselves reaching this level of despair, kind of a sense of hopelessness. Because in many cases, a person's life has become much more complicated as a result of the faith that they have in God. There are decisions that have to be made. There are types of a pathway that we have to take in life that is really going to be quite challenging to us, and consequently it becomes uncomfortable. And it appears that there is no end in sight, that this is the way it's going to be for the rest of my life. And more than likely, that is exactly right. That is the way it is going to be for the rest of an individual's life. And I think that's one of the reasons why God in His wisdom has set up local congregations, so that we can be around people who actually give us affirmation for the way that we are living our lives. And that's one of the reasons why I think that people who divorce themselves from local congregations find themselves either assimilating to the ways of the world or going into despair because they don't have anybody around them to affirm them, to be able to help them, to build up their faith and help them on this journey. And when they do reach this end of despair, then oftentimes what happens is they get angry. They may in fact be filled with all kinds of anxiety because of the things that are going on in the world in which we live, and that then obviously would lead to depression. So the point as we begin this lesson, and I know this is an introduction to Zechariah, and I hope to be able to tie this in so that you'll be able to see what it is that I'm talking about. The point I would make as we begin is that as we travel through this journey of faith, traveling on a path that is oftentimes difficult, the question then is, what is it that keeps us motivated? What has the Lord provided for us that will sustain us so as not to become assimilated to the world or keep us from being filled with despair while we are living in this world? Anybody have a thought about what is it that God has provided for us? There's one thing in particular I'm looking for. Now, there are many things that you might say, but there's one thing in particular that I'm looking for that keeps us going. And I will tell you this, the Hebrew writer referred to it as the anchor of the soul. So that should give you a clue. Hope. Hope. That's the one thing that keeps us going. And so it's with this now that we turn to the prophet Zechariah. So as we begin, we're going to first of all spend a little bit of time reviewing the context as we introduce the book. We'll go over some of the things as far as how the book breaks down. We're going to look particularly at the genre or the type of literature that it is, the way it was written. That'll help us to be able to understand some things, I hope, better about the book. And then we'll kind of wrap it up and get back to this whole principle of what hope, how hope is all involved in all of this. So we're going to begin by just simply looking, first of all, at the historical context. And so question 3 actually does get into the book of Zechariah. And I ask you, if you would, to list what you could about the prophet Zechariah. Now, there's a lot more that you can say about him than you can say about Haggai, because the fact is there is nothing that you can say about Haggai, but because there's no information. But there is information that is given to us about Zechariah. Anybody have anything that they want to suggest before I get into my little list here? Paul? Okay, that's right. The Lord remembers. And more likely, more accurately, the word Lord there would be all in capital letters, so it's the name of God, which would be Jehovah, or Yahweh, the one whom Yahweh remembers, which fits very well with the content of his writing, because what he is going to be doing is causing people to remember things. As we will see right at the very beginning of the book, that's the first thing he does, is tell people, you need to remember your ancestors. And we'll talk about that next week when we actually start getting into the text itself. Anything else about Zechariah that you have put on your little list? Dan? Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. And in fact, in Nehemiah's account, what Dan was talking about is the fact that he is referred to as the grandson in this, and is the grandson of Iddo. Iddo is the way that's spelled. And Dan did make the observation, some say son, which simply means he's a descendant. So we really don't know exactly how far back this goes, although grandson is probably one of the, just based upon the chronology, more than likely that's who it would be. But anyway, be that as it may, when you look particularly in Nehemiah's account, when he gives a listing of the Levitical peoples that came back, the priests and the Levites who came back under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua, and Nehemiah chapter 12, especially verse 4, Iddo is mentioned, and he's mentioned as one of the chiefs among the priests who traveled back to the city of Jerusalem from Babylon under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua, which would have been then around the year 536 BC during this reign of King Cyrus. Anything else you know about him? Bethany? Okay. During the reign of Darius is when he prophesies. And that helps us then to understand he's a contemporary with Haggai. And we'll have a little bit more to say about that in just a minute. There's one other observation, though. Dan?
Maybe not get Zechariah to be just a reference. He talks about the prophets that used his murder.
Right. 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 And for those of you who didn't hear, there are some who've suggested that this is the Zechariah that was actually killed, who had been martyred, that Jesus speaks of him. And but again, there's a lot of debate about that as to whether or not this was that Zechariah. But one thing is for sure, he lived in a very tenuous period of time. So there was no question about that. And if he did get killed, it wouldn't surprise me a bit. But the other thing that I would note with you is that he is actually identified as a prophet. Now remember, most of the prophets are not identified as prophets. Haggai is one, and Zechariah is one, and I believe there's one other one in the minor prophets who are actually referred to as prophets. So he is actually, it tells us what his work is, that he is a prophet, that this is his responsibility to deliver the message of God to a people who needed to hear the message. Now, as Bethany pointed out, the time frame in which he actually did his prophetical work was during the reign of King Darius. And this would have been, according to what it says there, he would have started just 2 months after Haggai had started his work, or actually after Haggai had started his work. And so what that shows is that Haggai and Zechariah are contemporaries. They actually prophesied for a short period of time during the same period of time. And there are some who have suggested that Zechariah, being the grandson of Iddo who came back during the period of when they were coming back, Iddo would have been a very elderly man. And so that makes Zechariah a relatively young man. Haggai, as we talked about, more than likely was a very old man. He only prophesied for 4 months. And so what some have suggested is what Haggai was doing was passing the baton to Zechariah. Because Zechariah's work goes on much longer than what Haggai's did. Haggai's lasted for a period of 4 months. And apparently, based upon what you see in the book of Zechariah, he would have prophesied for a period that lasted about 4 years. And so when we look at all of this, what we are seeing is this man who is a young man who has been given a responsibility to come to the people during a time that's very difficult. He, again, is at the same period of time as Haggai, which helps us to understand, again, a little bit more about the conditions of the time that were going on, because the conditions of the time would have been the same conditions that Haggai would have experienced. This would have been, what we need to remember is they've come back from Babylonian captivity. Israel was given permission to return to their homeland with the primary purpose of rebuilding the temple, as is indicated in Ezra chapter 1. And initially, under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua, it went well. I mean, they began like gangbusters. They went out and they laid the foundation. There was this great festive time when they had gotten the foundation as they were beginning the process of building this, but things began to change. They began to receive resistance from their enemies round about them. And so consequently, they stopped building. And that building, that is the delay in the building of the temple, well, you tell me, because Dan's gone over this a lot, and so we'll get to see if you remember what Dan's been saying. How long did this last, the delaying of this building of this temple? Anybody remember? It was about 16 years. Some have estimated up to 20, but it's 16 to 20 years that you have a delay in the rebuilding of the temple. In other words, it had just come to this screeching halt. And so in the second year of Darius, both Zechariah and Haggai received messages from God with the intent of motivating the people to renew their efforts to complete the rebuilding of the temple. And during this 16-year interruption of the work, there was very little evidence of the kind of transformation of the state of Israel, both physically and spiritually, that had been predicted earlier by some of the prophets who lived before the exile. Like, for instance, there's a passage over here in Isaiah chapter 35 that I want you to see, where Isaiah predicted what it was going to be like after they had come out of exile. And so beginning there in Isaiah chapter 35, beginning in verse 1, it says, "The wilderness and the dry land shall be glad. The desert shall rejoice and blossom like the crocus. It shall blossom abundantly and rejoice with joy and singing. The glory of Lebanon shall be given to it, the majesty of Carmel and Sharon. They shall see the glory of the Lord and the majesty of our God. Strengthen the weak hands and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who have an anxious heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come with vengeance, with recompense of God. He will come and save you. Then the eyes of the blind will be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap like a deer, and the tongue of the mute sing for joy. For waters break forth in the desert, and streams in the wilderness, and streams in the desert. The burning sand shall become a pool, and the thirsty ground springs of water, and the haunt of jackals where they lie down. The grass shall become reeds and rushes." Now, does that sound like what was happening in Israel at this time? It's exactly the opposite. When we were studying Haggai, remember that they couldn't even produce enough food in order to feed themselves. And so basically what you have happening here is that what they thought was going to be transpiring was not transpiring. It wasn't happening. And so under these conditions, well, in fact, I have this question, number 4, in Zechariah 4 verse 10 is the phrase, "the day of small things." What do you think he was talking about? Okay, all right. And this would even go back to the way they felt when they saw the temple actually being built. How that there was weeping. Instead of rejoicing, they were weeping. That is, those who had been familiar with Solomon's temple. And so it's like everything is inferior. Nothing is happening like the prophets had predicted was going to happen. And so as a result of this, under these conditions, it just simply made it easy for the people to conclude that their day was a day of small things, in which they concluded that God must be absent from his people, which led to one of the two attitudes that we've spoken of in this introduction. They either became assimilated to the people around them, and that's evident because you see that in Haggai chapter 1, verses 2 through 4, how that they began to pursue simply the best life possible under the present difficulties, and basically what they were doing was working on their own houses instead of working on God's house. So they were assimilating themselves to the peoples around them. That's one way. The other way was despair. They were depressed and they were anxious, especially when they began to compare the temple that was being built with the temple that had been destroyed. That is, those who had been familiar with that temple. And again, that's made clear in what is stated in Haggai chapter 2, verse 3, but especially it's made clear in Ezra chapter 3. So there is either the people were assimilating themselves to the peoples around them and just getting on with life, or they were in absolute despair. They were grieving because things were not the way that they thought they should be. So Haggai comes, and what his particular mission is to do is to motivate the people to get busy to rebuild the temple, reinstitute the priesthood and the sacrificial system. Zechariah's message contains that, but it contains much more. Because what he is focusing on now is the spiritual transformation of the people. Because the fact is, God cannot come back into covenant relationship with a people who will not yield to his directions. And that's one of the things we will see in one of the visions that Zechariah had, that he was trying to impress that upon these people. So the message that Zechariah brought to the people was a message that is designed to give them hope, that would lift the people up from their immediate difficulties to recognizing that there is glory that is coming. And especially is that true as he speaks to the future. And he talks about the future arrival of a king who is on the horizon, and with the promise that God would save his people. And that's recorded in the 9th chapter of Zechariah. And particularly, I want you to note what he says there in verses 14 through 17. Now, we'll cover this again in more detail. But it is a prophetic writing that is considering the time of the arrival of Jesus in particular, the time of the Messiah. But listen to what he says in verse 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout aloud, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and having salvation. He is humble and mounted on a donkey, on the colt, the foal of a donkey. And then he continues to go on. When you look at verse 14, the Lord will appear over them, and his arrow will go forth like lightning. The Lord God will sound the trumpet, will march forth in the whirlwinds of the south. The Lord of hosts will protect them, and they shall devour and tread down the sling stones. And they shall drink and roar as if the drunk with wine, and be full like a bowl, drenched like the corners of the altar. Verse 16, on that day the Lord their God will save them as the flock of his people, for they are like jewels of a crown that shall shine on his land. For how great is his goodness, and how great his beauty. Grain shall make the young men flourish, and new wine the young women. And so what he is telling them, in essence, is the fact that you do have something to look forward to. There is a promise, and that promise is going to be fulfilled by God. And so his whole purpose in coming is to get the people back onto the spiritual plane that they need to be on in order to be able to get them to once again find the hope that will enable them to no longer assimilate with the people and to no longer be filled with despair, but to be different, to be a part of what Reiser said is the lonely crowd, to be different and to take a stand for what was right. Okay, any observations that anybody wants to make as we look at that part of the introduction? Paul? I'm sorry? Okay, all right. And that's the reason why, because they thought this is just the day of small things. There's nothing big going on here. And so consequently, they weren't doing anything because, as I said, as I suggested, I think that their attitude was, God has left us. And what they need to understand is that God has not left them. And they need to, therefore, receive this message that Zechariah is giving to them. Okay, now as we deal with the book itself, there's just a couple of observations that I want to make. The first observation is that if you've read through the book, then you will be able to clearly delineate two major sections of the book. The first is in Zechariah chapters 1 through 8, which deals mostly with the rebuilding of the temple, the reinstituting of the priesthood, and the future of Jerusalem. And then the second major section is in chapters 9 through 14, which deals mostly with the distant future and the coming of the Messianic kingdom. Now, that's the easiest way to break that down. And in fact, there are some scholars who have said that Zechariah 9 through 14 is so different than chapters 1 through 8 that they actually believe it was another author that wrote it. Now, the evidence is overwhelming that it's Zechariah who wrote it. But that's how different these two sections are. So you have, within the first section, you have 8 night visions. And then within the second section, there are 2 oracles or 2 burdens that are being spoken, which deals with the distant future and the coming of the Messianic kingdom. The second observation is one that I want to get you all involved in, and that is the type of writing style that was employed by Zechariah. And I pointed out to you in question number 5 that one of the literary characteristics of the book of Zechariah is that it is apocalyptic. And so I ask you what that means. Now, you probably had to do a little bit of research. I mean, you could look it up in a dictionary. Pat did, and she got one of the sorriest definitions, just because the word apocalypse is something that has taken on a vastly different meaning than what it really means. When you hear the word apocalypse, what do you think of? I'm sorry? Well, that's not what most people think of, Roy. What? The end of the world. That's right. Disaster. Anybody who likes war movies, if you've seen Apocalypse Now, then you know what that's all about. It's about Vietnam, and everything is just horrible as they're running after this colonel or general, whoever he was, who'd gone insane. And so this whole thing of apocalypse in the modern day carries with it the idea of disaster and the end of the world. But that's not what the word means. Now we come to Roy's. Roy's probably the only one that thought about the true meaning of the word. And what it means is to unveil, to reveal. As a matter of fact, the book of Revelation, in the Greek language, that's the word apocalypsis. And that word means to reveal, to unveil. Okay, so it is a unique type of literature that is used in very dire circumstances, and it was used not simply by Jews. There were other people. There have been all kinds of writings from ancient documents that they have found that were during difficult periods for that particular kingdom or city or whatever, and they wrote in apocalyptic language. So apocalyptic is simply the idea of unveiling something, but how is it being unveiled? In figurative language, in code. That's the way one guy put it. In fact, one man I was reading after, he said that it is underground literature of people who are suffering occupation by a foreign power. They use an elaborate code. Apocalyptic writing tells a plain story, as real and difficult as the current threat might be. God will triumph in the end. And it doesn't matter what piece of literature you look at in the Bible, whether it's the book of Daniel, whether it is the book of Ezekiel, or whether it is the book of Zechariah. All three are apocalyptic. Or whether you go to the New Testament and you read the book of Revelation, which is apocalyptic. It is coded language, and it is written for the people who are suffering under the occupation of a foreign government in order to be able to help them to realize that God is going to win, that God will be victorious. And consequently, the whole point of it is to give them hope. Now, Israel at this time is occupied, are they not? They're occupied by the Persian Empire. And in fact, they're going to be occupied for the rest of their existence as a separate people. After Persia came the Greek Empire. After Greece came Rome. And Israel was always occupied by somebody else. And so, again, citing this man that I was doing a little bit of reading from, he said, apocalyptic writing uses the language of triumph, and it speaks from the perspective of hope realized. It is news from the other side, telegraphed back to those still entrenched, reporting a victory for the people of God. And the way that I personally have defined it is that it's a type of literature that has fantastic imagery. It speaks about extensive battles, and basically what they are the intersection of the spiritual with the physical, and how that they are being permitted to see what is going on in heaven. What is God doing? And he is writing it in such a way that it keeps the occupied people, that is, the people who are doing the occupying, from knowing what the true message really is. So it is a coded language that is written for a people that were suffering, but it is written for the purpose of giving them hope. And I think that when we begin to understand that, then we begin to at least put the book into a context that helps us appreciate how that we need to be looking for the messages of hope that are contained within it. You know, a lot of people will go through this apocalyptic literature, and they have developed what has been called a theology on eschatology, which is simply a systematic way of determining what's going to happen in the end time. And if you've ever talked to anybody about the book of Revelation in particular, you're going to get all kinds of crazy ideas coming out of people's mouths, what they think is happening. And so there's been all of these far-fetched interpretations as to when the end of time is going to occur. And what is it going to look like when it does? With all of the events that are spoken of in this coded language, and they take, in many cases, they actually literalize it, so that, we can look for, I mean, there are people right now, based upon what's going on, thinking that this is it. The Lord's about ready to come back. Quite frankly, I hope He does. I hope He comes back. I always hope He comes back. But that's not what the book of Revelation or any of these apocalyptic books are all about. And so, as I put down here in my notes, there is a fascination and a preoccupation with end-time events. And what happens is it obscures what are the more important lessons that the apocalyptic books are trying to teach us. And so we have to stop trying to figure out if these books are depicting the end times. Stop that nonsense. What we need to do is look for the message that was intended for the people to whom it was written. And we see that it is filled with great hope. And that's what these people needed. So, as we go through the contents of the book of Zechariah, I'm going to do my best to try to provide you a proper understanding of the symbols that are found in it. There's going to be different ideas, I'm sure, as to what they might mean, but I'm going to do my best to tell you what they mean. But what's more important is trying to discern the meaning of the symbolic language in order to be able to discern the lessons that Zechariah was trying to teach his people to provide them with hope. And that's going to be really the primary objective that I'm going to be trying to accomplish as we go through all of this strange language, strange things that we read about. Mark?
I think in doing that interpretation, we need to treat them much like we do with parables, which are much less complex, much less fantastic than as far as visions. But usually they're not purely allegories. Everything in the story doesn't represent something.
Right.
There's a central truth
Right.
the parable works about. The visions are about.
Right.
That we need to find and grasp that and then understand everything else in the line. That's
Exactly. Right.
And that, as I said, there's much more going on in these visions, particularly in Daniel. The Ezekiel book of Revelations, they're fantastic. They're difficult even to imagine. Those beasts with the number of heads and wings
Right,
and stuff
right.
that they got.
Yeah. Sounds like a nightmare.
That usually isn't the important thing.
Right.
That's usually the incidental thing. You need to
Right.
watch what happens in the action.
Exactly.
So, again, God's intending, the Spirit wants to reveal these. He wants to unveil these truths to us using this specific type of language that's useful for other things.
Right.
The occupied people and the people that aren't being self-governed and all those things that mesh with the history. But it's not intended to confuse the allies about them. It might be meaning, you could argue that it's meant to confuse the enemies of God.
Right.
But it's not
Just like a
meant to
parable.
confuse God's people.
Right.
God's people are supposed to get the
Right. And that's what Zechariah is trying to do, is to teach them what they need to know in order to be able to provide them with hope using coded language that they would have understood. So we're going to do our best to try to understand it, but I do believe that we can clearly understand the messages that are going to be, that we can ascertain from these particular pieces of writing that Zechariah gives us. Okay, so as we think about it with respect to the message for Israel, we have to remember that the returned exiles at this time were experiencing all kinds of resistance to their objective of rebuilding the temple and reinstituting the priesthood, reinstituting the sacrificial system that was their religious system. And again, we have to keep in mind that they were either assimilating themselves to the peoples around them or they were filled with despair because things weren't going the way they thought they should be going. And so Zechariah is coming with a series of messages that are filled with hope, with the intent of accomplishing what is the needed spiritual transformation of the people. There is more to being the people of God than just building a temple. They have to do something else. And that is they have to get their lives straightened out. Okay, so as I pointed out, the first 8 chapters contain 8 night visions, predicting that the temple will be rebuilt, the priesthood will be reestablished, along with the Jewish sacrificial system, and that Jerusalem has a bright future if the people are obedient to God. So that's what those night visions are all about. Now, in chapters 9 through 14, they predict and they address the coming of a ruler from the line of David. In other words, the Messianic king, who would be victorious and who would lead God's people to ultimate victory at the end of time, although this pursuit would not be without challenges. So that's the gist of the 2 sections that we're going to be looking at. Now what I want to do for the rest of the time, we only got 5 minutes left. I want to tell you some of the big themes that I think are found within this book that provides this whole concept of hope. First of all, there is this concept of God's sovereignty. We talked a little bit about that with respect to the book of Haggai. There is a phrase that is used, the Lord of hosts. And that is used by Haggai a lot, but it's used by Zechariah the most. In fact, he uses it 53 times, 18 times in chapter 8 alone. And that, as we pointed out when we were studying Haggai, there's a lot that can be gleaned from that particular characterization of God as far as his nature is concerned. But in general, what it reveals is that God is the supreme ruler over everything. He is the Lord of hosts. And so God is totally sovereign. He is far greater than any king, and he will be victorious. He will accomplish his will. So that's one theme that's in it. A second theme, and I do have a question about that, but again, we don't have time to actually address the question, so I'm just going to give you the answer. And that is the fact that God is with his people to save them. That comes up time after time. And when you think about it, after the horror of Israel's captivity and their exile, God is now renewing his commitment to restore Israel as his people. They would still experience suffering, but in the end, God would judge their oppressors, and he would bring ultimate deliverance through the coming of the Messiah, who will in fact rule over the whole world, bringing their salvation. And then a third theme, and this is something again that surfaces frequently throughout the book, is the importance of being faithful to God. Zechariah was concerned that the returned exiles not repeat the mistakes of their forefathers. That's how he begins his entire prophetic writing in Zechariah chapter 1. And so he emphasizes how important it is not only to rebuild the temple, but how important it is to rebuild their characters and their commitment to God and to his will. And then also it talks about the hope that only God can provide. Throughout his message is this overall theme that God is going to give victory to those who are faithful to him, because as he says there in Zechariah chapter 9, he is mighty to save. And in this assurance, he found for the people, and he was trying to deliver to the people, what is unspoken encouragement to not become assimilated to the people around them and to not be filled with despair, because their future looks bright. Things can be joyous for them. And particularly is that true if they are faithful to God. Now, God's going to do what God's going to do. He has his desired will, what he wants these people to do, but then he has his determined will, what he is going to do. And whether or not the people are faithful, God's going to accomplish his will. But what Zechariah is saying is, be faithful to God and you will be the beneficiaries of God's great blessings. And I think that those are some of the things that we need to learn today as well. And I think that's some of the messages that we're going to be able to get from this as we go through our studies. Now that God is with his people to save us, it is important that we be faithful to God no matter what happens, and then to recognize the hope that God is providing for us. And it is a hope that has been prophesied by Zechariah in the coming of Jesus, and we are the beneficiaries of that. We have received that. And so we should be filled with hope. And what hope does then is it motivates us not to become like the world around us, but instead to be different, to yield to the calling of not being a part of this world, even though we live in it. And this hope also, and I think this is something that is so important to understand, that this hope calms our fears. And it helps us then not to despair when things just don't seem to be going as we think they ought to. Because we know God is in control and God is working things for the good of his people. He is working it for his glory and his honor as he exercises it through the great blessings that he gives to his people. So hope is a powerful word. But more than that, I would say to you it's a powerful weapon. And it worked extremely well for Zechariah as he provided these messages. So what he is doing, as I sum this all up, is that he and all of the other prophets anticipated Jesus as the hope of Israel. And he pointed to a coming day when God would enter human history through the coming of a king who would bring salvation. And this vision encompassed two entries of this king. And that's something we need to understand, and I hope to be able to develop that as we go through this. One of the entries of the King we've already experienced, and that is when Jesus came to this earth. But there's another entry, and it's an entry that has not yet happened that we anticipate, and that is when He comes again. And so it is with this hope then that we can move forward and we can anticipate the second entry of Jesus into our world. And what is so fascinating to me as I was researching all of this just for the introductory remarks is that in Zechariah chapter 9 verse 12, He calls the people prisoners of hope. And I would say to you that if we are faithful to God, that's who we are. We are prisoners of hope. And so I'm looking forward to digging into the text as we begin next week and looking at these wonderful messages that Zechariah had for his people and things that we can learn from it. Thank you all for your discussion tonight.
Thank you, Tom.